Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Brenda. I'm here to answer any general or technical questions that you may have today. Now, before we get started, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which is the role of content in customer satisfaction. And here on your screen, you'll see a rough outline of our agenda for the day. We'll take about 5 minutes for some quick introductions. The presentation itself will be about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll jump into some live Q&A afterwards. Now, let's just go over a few of the functions on the platform here. So, of course, I see a few members already in the audience chat. You'll see that you can chat with other attendees or ask or chat with our speakers today within that audience chat. Definitely feel free to join and let us know where you're joining from. I myself am joining you from sunny Phoenix, Arizona, which, surprise, today is a little bit cloudy. But next, we're going to jump into CMS Wire. So this is a little bit about us. We were founded in 2003, and we cover the primary topics that you see here on your screen. Now, if you'd like to learn more about us, read our articles, or register for upcoming events or webinars like today's, you can do so by visiting www.cmswire.com. And of course, I'd like to take some time to thank today's sponsor, which is Quark. They have made today's webinar possible. So here's just a little bit about Quark and what they can offer. Quark has been a pioneer in desktop publishing, digital publishing, and content automation since 1981. Today, customers rely on Quark for closed-loop content lifecycle management so they can meet their desired goals, whether that's entertaining subscribers with a digital magazine, educating employees through standard operating procedures, or furnishing regulators with documents to demonstrate compliance. Quark, brilliant content that works. Now, of course, you can learn more about Quark by visiting their website, which is www.quark.com. Now, before we get into today's content, I want to take a few seconds to introduce today's speakers. Today, I'm joined by Lisa Gately, Principal Analyst at Forrester. Lisa has more than 20 years of experience in B2B technology content, communications, events, and services marketing. She helps Forrester clients build and optimize their B2B content engines and transform them into competitive differentiators. Lisa is an evangelist for audience-centric content strategy, content marketing, and content operations. Today, I'm also joined by Emerson Welch, VP of Marketing at Quark. With over 25 years of B2B software product marketing experience, Emerson has successfully led marketing teams for small startups, channel partners, and large enterprises. Emerson's technology expertise in content automation, creative collaboration workflows, ERP, CRM, IT support services, and more has resulted in a consistently strong track record of enabling sales to grow revenue through simple messaging and innovative content. Now, Emerson is actually going to be joining us towards the end of today's webinar when we jump into our Q&A session. For now, Lisa, Emerson, thank you both for being here today, but I'm actually going to pass it over to Lisa to go ahead and get us started on today's presentation.
Thanks, Brenda, and welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you. Let's get into the topic. We know that content's a major part of the customer experience. Yet, despite its outsized role, content is really everyone's challenge and everyone's opportunity. The reason for that, as you can see, is content is created in all different parts of the organization. We are creating and using content for multiple audiences. Many of them have different needs, different preferences, and we're using it during all different stages of the customer life cycle. That leads to a lot of challenges. You could say that the doing of content is fairly complicated. Now, despite its importance, a lot of teams are still struggling with this. So you may be wondering, what's still holding us back? Why is content so complicated in getting the right content to our audiences and delivering the customer satisfaction that we want? Well, you could say that because of the siloed nature of a lot of teams, we see very fragmented experiences from the very start of the content lifecycle. We've all heard the saying about trying to target your audience with the right content at the right place at the right time. We've been saying that for years, but truly a lot of organizations aren't aligned on which audiences they're prioritizing, or they may still be delivering content that's more inwardly focused than what the audience needs. It's also really challenging when content creators' production teams are using some outdated or manual tools or processes that don't scale. It could be that they're still operating with a first in, first out kind of mentality, or first come, first serve, as far as how you place requests and prioritize all of the content that's in the queue. And usually a lot of content creators have limited information about how the content is being used. It may be that teams are hitting the constraints about how quickly and how well they can customize. They're making some guesses about how to personalize their content. And they may not have some technologies that they need to be able to automate or get the insights of what's performing. So that what we're talking about today is how can you look at each of these stages of the content lifecycle? I'll give you a few data insights, and then we'll talk through some of the challenges. What can you do about it to make it more actionable and be sure that you're delivering the right content for your customers? So we know that a foundational capability is starting with the content planning. If we look at this, it could be said that really it is all about having a defined and repeatable process for content planning. That sounds straightforward enough, but it's actually very difficult. When I talk with a lot of organizations, and this is borne out by some of the Forrester studies lately, our State of B2B Content Survey, almost half of organizations don't have a defined or repeatable process. And you wonder, why is that? If we're doing a lot of this planning more haphazardly, could it be the siloed nature of how teams create content? Are we being reactive? Again, there's an ad hoc nature to adjusting content plans. A lot of that really shows up. So if you're looking at some of these challenges for customer satisfaction, let's talk about how we could take this challenge and turn that around, do something about it. From the start, organizations know they're going to be creating a lot of content for different audiences, but I find more and more, it helps when there's some cross-functional planning to prioritize the audiences and what content they have in mind for each of them. Whether you're looking at persona level, buying group, market segments, geographies, any way you're trying to divide up what kind of content you need by the audience, really having some prioritization will help you downstream. It's also very important in using customer insights and journey mapping. That's also something that we've been hearing about for years, but I talk to more and more teams who have limited insights. They may only have a snapshot view of what's happening in the buying journey or the customer life cycle. It's actually really important though, and as you're able to piece together some of the data, you want to know what are your customers' content preferences, what are their localization requirements. And what I mean by that is, what's the information your customers are looking for? Where do they go for the information? Do they have any preferred channels or preferred format types for content? And when it comes to localization, although English may be the language of business, are there some factors that really should prepare us for how we create content so that it's localized easily and reused? It could be not only the copy, but the imagery, or it could be larger cultural context we take into account when we're planning the content, the very substance of both copy and images, and anything else that we're producing from video, audio files, so that it can be reused all across the world. I see a lot of teams who struggle when it comes to operationalizing with messaging. That may come up in how well messaging has been covered with different teams. And back to that point about prioritizing your audiences. What do you have to say for audiences at a specific time? But it's also thinking about how can you deliver messages that are really going to be well received, that you're speaking your customer's language, so to speak. You're not using internal speak or buzzwords or jargon. You're really thinking about it from the audience's point of view, and definitely from their search habits, their search intent. Finally, one of the challenges we see again and again is using performance insights about your existing content. What can you learn to inform your new plans? Many times there's only a partial view or very limited, if at all, view for some content creators. they don't know how the content has been used or what exactly is resonating or working. And that slows them down when they're going to create the next piece of content. They could be incorporating some of that feedback into their work. So let's look at another area. If you were to consider what could you take back to your teams and think about in improving your content planning? Really, it is looking across the full customer life cycle. Now, we know that teams are looking at very likely portions of this life cycle. That again leads us to the need for cross-functional collaboration. That if there are different parts of your organization building different types of content for different customers, it really is going to be beneficial to build a cross-functional inventory. That means, although it's a lot of work, you are tracking what kind of content do you have across the life cycle? What is out there in market that somebody could find? And that way it's helping you so that the next time you're going to go create content, you should be able to see what already exists and start making decisions about what you could reuse rather than create something brand new. It also gives you some really interesting insight because you would notice, where do you have some gaps? Are there stages of the customer life cycle? Are there particular personas where you don't have the content you need? Or are there certain topics where you really want to start filling in what you have? Take that kind of gap analysis and use that to make your content planning much more precise and share that with others. That way you would avoid any inadvertent duplication or content waste. So let's move to content production. Now, content production, of course, is the area a lot of people think about when you talk about content overall. It is super important, but it rests on that foundation of planning. So once you've planned your content, if the planning is all about having a defined and repeatable approach, think about your content production as an opportunity to streamline or automate some of your workflow or processes. It's also where you want to see how can your teams get really good at reuse. So again, pulling from our stats, the State of B2B Content Survey, that same study, what we heard is nearly half of marketers say they are beginners at measuring content process KPIs. And what I mean by that is it's measuring how many assets do you have in progress right now? What's the average time to complete an asset? What are your review cycles looking like? How much time are you spending in back and forth in review cycles? How much is it taking to what's the cost? What's the total time to produce an asset? Those kinds of figures about your process are going to inform you about where you have some bottlenecks, where you could make some improvements. And really, nearly half of marketers don't know. You could say that maybe it adjusts in different parts of the business. Marketing is just an example. But if you were to take that and look at that, we know the saying, what gets measured gets managed. Really, you want to see teams using more automated tools, automating your workflows, and being able to measure some of these things. So let's take a look at the bigger picture of these challenges in production teams, starting from maybe the beginnings phases, that content calendaring piece, and the complexity of managing a lot of major projects when you think about some of your content investment. You may be wondering, what does that have to do with customer satisfaction? Well, it turns out also from the same study, we learned that, again, a large percentage of respondents say they don't have a single calendar. There's no view to get visibility into the content that's being worked on. So it's a clue that there's some inadvertent either duplication, or at times you're going to see some content coming up that maybe no one knows about. It could be varying stages of quality, accuracy, did it even go through review cycles? So I look at that as a signal about the calendaring and how you're managing some of those projects. There's really no single view across the organization. If you can even improve on it, make some steps to have fewer silos, that is an improvement for a lot of organizations. It's also looking at your process and workflow, which I was talking about earlier. We'll get into that in just a moment, but much more deeply, that's going to lead to how you get rid of that overhead, that burden, that a lot of manual activity that teams are going through. Some of that's created in this list, these last 3 bullet points. If you're managing multiple agencies, many different vendors, different teams working with different agencies and vendors, you get the flavor for how much back and forthing there may be and how much in terms of visibility into what is going on where. When is anything going to be available? it leads teams to sometimes take matters into their own hands and go create their own content. That's also true for translation and localization. You could see that activity being handled in multiple parts of an organization, multiple tools, agencies. Again, the governance. If we talk about this from brand, style, terminology, all the different flavors of governance, that's usually a challenge because so many times teams are doing this and they're having to look over their shoulder for what else is coming next. We don't have visibility and we're surprised by a lot of things that may be going on in the organization around us. So what do you do about this? All right, this is the transition point where you'd say, yes, we all want to increase. How can we deliver our content without that tremendous overhead? How do we drive more reuse, more automation, make it so that it's easier for the content creators and our organization knows you're getting the quality content your customers need? It really is as much about changing your mindset. And we'll talk about this. It is really important to start looking at the tools that your content creators are using, the tools, the process, the workflow. But it's just as much a people issue. It's thinking about how you work together differently. And then as you start carrying through, you're going to start adjusting. Nobody gets here overnight. But for the things that you're seeing on this slide, the power it can give you is faster time to market to get your content out to the world, better brand adherence or quality, valuable content, the content your customers are expecting of you, the ability to personalize it and to be compliant for your industry. All of these things matter. It's really on us to start stepping into doing that. So here are a few ideas. The first, as I was saying, is automate your workflows and establish SLAs. Well, this slide has a very simplified example. What you really want to do is start to take a look. You may have established your workflows. You have had some SLAs in time. If you're like a lot of organizations, maybe you've had some changes in teams. You're starting to experiment with different technologies. It's time to take a look at this. As you work across different teams, looking at and comparing the workflows. How do people get the content work done? What are the steps? Who's involved as reviewers? Are there ways to perhaps streamline certain steps you don't need anymore because there have been some changes? Or you're looking at where you can smooth out some areas. Maybe there are too many reviewers. In any case, make some judgments about how to tune your workflows. And that way, if you're looking at some technologies, you're very prepared at having some of the workflow evaluation done already. It also helps you as you could update your service level agreements or your SLAs. This is another part of that collaboration issue with teams of knowing when to expect content, what comes next in the process, and how long things will take. You'll be able to update your SLAs and communicate with a lot of requesters, content creators, and teams who are using the content. Now, this next area is stepping into modular content. It could be that for some of you, you've been working in this style for quite some time. I know that speaking for many marketers, this is newer. And for other teams, maybe in between, they're in varying stages of using modular content. This is where you're looking at content, and instead of taking a full, already completed asset during the creation process, you're working at a component level. That could be an image, a file, a paragraph, some product specs, a quote, smaller components of content, and you're tagging them with metadata so that in your systems, you could combine these components in multiple ways and get to personalization that much faster. You can also go recreate multiple formats of this. And this is the dream. If you talk to a lot of folks who are coming out of tech docs or other backgrounds, this is a much more standard way of working overall. But when you talk to marketers and some other parts of the business, usually you'll find they're stepping into this. If you haven't already, start examining what types of content, maybe it's your website, maybe there are other types of content, where could you step into doing this? This gets you on a path to greater reuse, creating once and being able to publish many times in many formats, and also get into the personalization that you want for your customers. Now, a third idea, you may have stopped and looked at, those first two areas of workflow, SLAs, modular content. You may be asking, what else could we do? Is there something where we could see something quarter over quarter, we could start to see improvements. And yes, there's one more approach. If I'm thinking about this from the standpoint of a lot of teams, they know they're going to plan a set of content. Think about sequencing this and using what you call a primary and derivative assets approach. What I mean by this is if you're working on a big pillar piece of content, whether that's a report, a white paper, a big guide that you are using somehow, go through the plan on producing that primary asset, but also with your team, work through what are the derivative assets that you want to make available. And this is where I'm talking about the examples like blogs, infographics, webinars, slides. You get the idea. There are some other pieces that reuse the content from that primary asset. That's where you're going to get some, what I'd say, leverage there to go personalize and create those derivatives in a very related way so that you've got a set of content, but perhaps you could also personalize for your customers and sequence things for their best use if you're looking at where they want to consume the content and when they need it. This is another way that in terms of reuse, especially, maybe like me, you've worked on projects like this where you want to get multiple creators and teams engaged. You can also start to get people working in tandem. That way it's not quite so sequential. So if you're working toward faster time to market, you've got some source material and you can come out very quickly with some derivative assets. So let's move into talking about content promotion. After you've done the planning, you've done the creation, a lot of times teams haven't put as much thought into promotion, or it's a different team that's thinking about where and how are you going to promote the content. This is where I would say promotion, or the distribution, activation of the content, if you will, is every bit as important. So for many of us, you've worked through the content, you've thought about, and now you're actually coming through with content, and it's going to be activated across many different channels. It could be that you want your audience to get to this content directly. It could be you're going to provide this to your employees, your sales teams, your partners, other people who will then take it and use it with your audience. In that case, you want to make sure that people can find it. Now, a couple stats here. We can't resist telling you that from some of our studies, a different one this time, our most recent content preferences study, existing customers of a supplier tell us at least half of them want their supplier to know what's most important to them in their job role. And what you could take away from that is if you are someone who's providing information to the customer, it's not just coming to them through direct digital channels. You're actually promoting it to them, setting it up, if you will. You need to know what's most important to them so that you're telling them why is it worth their time and attention. It's not only creating the asset, but helping anybody who's activating and promote the content set this up for customers. You also want them to find it very easily. And by them, I mean your sales teams, your partners, your employees. We really took a look from some of our studies about how many different locations sales teams are looking when it comes time to find content they need to share with a customer. That's a big showstopper when it comes time to find the content and make sure, have I got this right? Is this the latest information? So it's no wonder with some of these challenges, when it comes to having information to personalize and promote the content to your customers or your intended audience, it's connecting the signals to where is the customer in the either buying journey or the life cycle. Are they ready for this? Is this something that's really applicable to them in their situation? There's a lot of judgment that goes through for someone. And then, as I mentioned, it's making sure, do your sales, your customer success, your support and partner teams, can they find what they need? Has it been localized? And have you gotten this out to your employees if it's something that should go through a lot of your usual channels for internal communications? Now, what could you do about this? I would say step back and re-examine how effective are some of your channels when you're getting out the content. If you're looking at treating maybe internal audiences, they're taking the content and getting it to customers versus any place where you are directly serving up the content externally to customers. Make sure you've aligned some of this to your audience's promotion. That's what I mean by the dual audiences that you see here in the diagram. Make sure this content is easy for, let's say, your sales team or partners or your support team to find. It's also making sure customers can find it. And you want to track their usage. If you want to track, let's say, what the sales team or support team has been sharing, can you also get a view into how they've customized the content? How is it promoted? A lot of this comes back to using your tagging and technologies. So the better you are at doing the tagging, the better you're in shape to be able to use technologies to serve up content via recommendations. You're also able to improve the experience overall. And I mean this by cleaning up some of the clutter. We all have it, but it's taking all of the content you have today, looking at what has been tagged and making some judgments about should you adjust some of the tagging so that people could find it? Or do you have some content that's really outdated or duplicative and it's time to reduce all of the content you've got in a repository so that your audiences find it and it gets used? Now, if we go on into the next stage of content performance management, I'll call it content operations. This is a really critical area. After you've planned, created, promoted the content, you're really at a stage where I'm saying you're managing the content you have and you're making some decisions in managing it. What should you do in informing the business going forward? That's really a big job. And I, in particular, emphasize this because it's really where I see a lot of organizations lack the skills. It could be because sometimes there's no oversight. This type of activity is considered a little bit of different people's jobs. And that's why in our latest State of B2B content survey, marketers told us they rate themselves at beginners in this. If you look at some of the competencies, if it's managing the content you have, it's using metadata and tagging consistently, it's your taxonomy practices. Overall, this is where a lot of marketers, in one group in an organization, maybe others too, could sharpen up and definitely communicate across functions so that for sure you want to start to see an organization using one single taxonomy rather than multiple taxonomies across different systems. That's going to stop you from being able to find content, measure it, or even use some of the automation to be able to serve up the content when you need it. We also see a lot of teams are dealing with process and technology gaps. And again, that lack of oversight, it may be back to the very siloed environment where everybody's doing a little bit of this, but there is no one looking at this overall for the organization and finding a better way. So here are some more ideas on that. I really want this to play out, and I'll give you this example. In talking about this from a data point of view, again, such a big fact coming from our State of B2B content survey is that in talking to marketers, almost half are not using modular content. Almost half of them don't have a calendar. They don't have visibility into what's coming. Most of them are dealing with content in multiple repositories. And more than half of them, their organizations aren't using a universal taxonomy. So that means they're going to multiple repositories to find things and try to measure what content's being used. That is a whole lot of extra work to normalize that data, if they could get it. It's no wonder then, this compounding effect, at the bottom of the slide, 65% of organizations are saying they're struggling with content waste. That's really a marketing viewpoint, but it is a small slice of some organizations. It may be broader. All of this is to say, you really need to devote the skills, the time and attention to content operations. So with some of the tips, the first of them here is really the power of having a universal taxonomy and a unified metadata strategy. You could think of taxonomy as the keys to the kingdom when it comes to your content. And what I mean by that is anywhere you're storing content, you're tagging it, you're trying to report on it, you're trying to get a picture of what gets used. You want to be able to find what you have. If you're doing some of these regular updates about how to reuse existing content, it's also using technology to do some of that automation and personalization we talked about earlier. It's very powerful if you are using your taxonomy and your metadata to best effect. What to do though, if you're part of that majority who find your organization has multiple taxonomies, you've got some ideas for how to make some improvements. A definite tip here is use a repeatable framework like the one on the slide. Bring other people on board with you. So if you've got an idea, you're going to make some improvements, try to set some scope around what you want to change with the taxonomy and have a pilot. Get some feedback from others in your organization and validate what are some of the things that you're going to be changing. What's the taxonomy and tagging structure going to look like in future state? And try to test this out as you deploy it in the pilot. You'll learn from the experience if you've got others who are using the technology, others across functions who are major content stakeholders. Get their feedback and finding out how this has affected them and the doing of their work. And then you could keep refining your taxonomy. Now, another idea, I have clients ask all the time, what should I be measuring for content? I would say with a resounding recommendation is, first, work with others and look at what you can measure. This is, again, it's going to be affected by your taxonomy and your technologies, but you really want to have a mix of content process metrics. We talked about that earlier. It's measuring your production efficiency, having a handle on what's going through in terms of content production. You also then want to look at content performance, whatever you can measure. And there's no universal answer. Depending on the kind of content you produce, where that content appears, what kinds of systems, technologies you're using. The importance is to have this blended view. And I really find few organizations do all of it well. So everybody struggles with this to some degree. Start where you can. Start wherever you are, but start getting a picture on how would you measure production if you had to talk about where is the time and money being spent on content, and you're looking at what's working with your audience. So in this case, if you're looking at customer satisfaction, how do you know what your customers are using and what's resonating with them? Now, another factor to this is how can you improve overall content experience, performance? How can you use technologies to best effect? There are a lot of different tools and technologies. And again, this could be very siloed across organizations, but take a look at what your organization has. I'd recommend do an inventory of all the technologies that are being used across your capabilities, from content creation to workflow, distribution, anything you're doing for asset management and any of your analytics. You might find there are ways that you could share technologies across teams. You could use what you have better. Or there are ways if you wanted to step into something newer together. If you've got to look into some integrations, let's say, or if you were looking to make some leaps and doing the automation we talked about, or greater use of newer technologies. Just remember, the technologies are very important. Get others on board with you. You are always going to have the process and the training and the communication side of this coming along. So it could be that you're trying to have people use what you have better, or it could be stepping into using some new technologies. But all of that really is starting where you can today and moving forward, not in a silo. So let's bring this all together. If you look back at what are some key things that could help your organization improve the content and make it so the content plays a major role in customer satisfaction. I leave one final tip or actionable area. And no surprise, it really is an emphasis on cross-functional collaboration. Many times teams are going it alone, and it's very hard to scale some of those practices or build any of that consistency we talked about in the very beginning across the customer lifecycle so that customers have a consistent quality experience. What you could do is partner across teams. This is just an illustration only, but you may start out with one or two other functions who are also concerned about some areas of content. Pick only a couple of areas. This list of opportunities is just a starter. Don't try to go after all of them at once. Pick a couple of these areas, and if you were to get together in some kind of regular group, call it a council, editorial board, use whatever names work in your organization. But that way, if you are picking a few initiatives that you're going to build momentum on together, you make some progress, and together you'll go a lot further. So to sum up, if you take away some actions, what you could do, After today, I've given you some ideas. If you go back to your organization and you start assessing your current content practices across functions that use content with customers, all across the customer lifecycle, how are things going? Do that assessment. And with that, talk with teammates about where can you invest in, whether it's additional resources or time or competencies. How can you put some attention on content operations? Because I'm betting the data is most teams need some help there. That's also going to be a great support for you then as you start stepping into some of the automation or reuse ideas that I talked about today. Most organizations could use some help refining that or stepping into that. And then as you get going, really commit to mastering metadata and taxonomy. Those are your keys to the kingdom if you want to be able to measure the value and really get signals about what your customers need going forward. So you're that much more data-driven about what content you create next. That content collaboration council I mentioned earlier is really where you can build some cross-functional momentum. And that way, if you're working together on what are some of the major opportunities to make improvements, you've got a baseline. And you could then start using data to inform your future content decisions. So let's pause. Forrester has quite a bit of research in this area. I'll leave this up for just a moment, but we're going to start shifting over. Emerson and I are going to take on Q&A.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
So we do have some questions coming in that we'd like to ask. I think here's the first one we can start with. Can you share more insights about current customers' specific content needs and expectations?
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate that. We just released our latest study on content preferences. And so when you look at this, we did a cut of B2B technology decision makers who were current customers of a vendor. And so you're asking current customers, they really prefer their vendors for information about product and services, no surprise. But I underscore that because a lot of organizations are thinking about what comes next, or appealing to buyers. Know that you've got an advantage in working on any content for your customer. They turn to you first as an expert. And in fact, they rate it above what they hear from their peers or tech news. But they will also insist on hearing from their peers. So if you've got any customer generated content, if you've got customer stories, if you've got some advocates who are sharing what's it been like working with you, in addition to information about your offerings, anything you can offer from other customers is valued. They really look to you for any content that helps them figure out trends that will predict a future state. So think about that. Those are some of the insights about, telling them more about what your offerings can do, back to thinking about what stage they're in and knowing what to recommend next. They really do have a lot of, I'd say, desire for the vendor to be able to do that for them. And people always ask, what are favorite content formats? Our current customers love it when we have presentations from our events. Doesn't matter if it's in person or virtual, find ways to reuse that content. You also have an advantage. They would love to have anything from you, whether it's brief documents, I'll call it 4 to 6 page length. Customers will pay attention to longer formats. There's a lot of talk in content about short attention spans. That's true, but your customers will pay attention to more in-depth, like 8 to 10 page plus type content from you.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, with the majority of customers we engage with are driven by goals really that align with, normally aligns with digital transformation, regulatory compliance, customer satisfaction, obviously, and revenue growth. So we find those 4 areas are normally at the top of the list for goals.
Yep.
Right, so that's great. Next question, what can organizations do to review and refine their content infrastructure?
Yeah, it's a really important one because as I was mentioning, there are a lot of teams who you may find different technologies used, whether it's different business units or different geographies. There's sometimes a split across an organization. If you find yourself in that, or even if you've been using some technology for a while, you're admitting maybe it's time to take another look. If it's been getting outdated, I would do an inventory, what you have. I would also make an effort on documenting your business requirements. It's easy to get distracted by what you could do and the new technology available, but look at what your requirements really are and talking to people who are involved at different stages of the content lifecycle. Again, I mentioned earlier about also looking at when you see what you have or what you want to move toward, maybe you're doing fuller use of what you have, but you need some integrations, or maybe you realize you're going to migrate to something else. It's thinking with the end in mind. You really want to plan forward. It's not just the technology, but it's how people work together. So be ready to get in and do the process work and the training and think about longer term. How do you have more integrations and more teams using this so that you don't have silos?
Yeah, I can completely agree with that. I mean, taking a look at your people to see if the team actually has the skills and the capacity to support your journey, your content journey, I think that's massive. And you combine that with the technology that you may have or may not have. And yeah, scaling your content infrastructure, it can be done in time once you've perfected what you're doing right now. You've got the right people in place, and that gives you the confidence, doesn't it, to move forward. Yeah, so great. So next question. When it comes to content and customer satisfaction, how much focus should be placed on the technology infrastructure versus the people skills, as they both play a role in success? Well, I guess I could sort of start with that one. I think it's fair to say that ultimately the people are responsible for delivering customer satisfaction, designing the processes, choosing the technology infrastructure that goes with it. But automated technology should be in place, and that will help sort of augment and deliver the defined customer's content strategy right across the business and every customer touch point. So you have those regulated assets, the media, the insights to optimize those people because that technology is in place. So I would say people readiness and skills readiness are both critical, as are having the right characters in the team to make sure that it gets all sort of rolled out together.
That's a great assessment of it. I agree.
Good stuff. Okay, so another question. When is it time to update or retire a piece of content? Yeah, I think you touched on this. I mean, from our point of view, knowing when to reuse, repurpose, or retire content is pretty difficult without content intelligence giving you that accurate real-time information. You may think you've created the best content ever, but the stats don't lie, really, do they? If no one is finding it or consuming it, then it's essentially worthless. Needs potentially then a reposition or even taken out of circulation entirely. So, and content intelligence, as you mentioned earlier, also helps when it comes to creating the content, because if you analyze your audience's general consumption habits and thinking about right place, right time, right format, you're much more likely to create content that will engage and resonate with them on the device or the surface that they use the most. And that, I guess, helps you sort of extend the life cycle of that content. Great. So here's the next question. So talking about the model, who actually owns the model in the organization? What kind of people would actually take responsibility for rolling this kind of, when you think of things like modular content, would actually, who would take responsibility for doing that? Lisa, if you could take that one, maybe?
Yeah, so that's a good one. It may vary. I'm going to take a sip of water here. One moment.
Sure.
Excuse me.
No, that's okay.
It may vary depending on where you are starting. If this...
Yeah, no problem.
Sorry for that. If it's a marketing, product, or sales-led initiative, or it's coming from support, start with one of those functions. And usually you will start to get others on board. So depending on, let's say, if you are looking at technical documentation for product, usually there's a really strong impetus in those organizations to work in modular content. In marketing, you'll see it more so in website, perhaps. But yeah, marketers could use a good push. And of course, then in sales, there are a lot of tools now that are enabling modular content use. So that's another area.
Yeah, I mean, our tool sort of spans all of it, really. So we have the sales enablement end, but we also have the front end, which is very sort of highly technical, structured authoring, but we actually make that easy because we produce the XML metadata behind the scenes, so the people who use our software don't have to be trained in XML or trained in DITA to be able to produce content to that standard. So that's quite useful. So really, you could have different points within the organization owning it. It could be the IT, it could be the actual subject matter experts, or it could be sort of the marketing team. So depending on the persona and the use case, it could be a number of different people, really. Okay, so next question. What is the role of market segmentation in content personalization?
So, excuse me, interesting one in terms of market. If you are noticing there's different needs, let's say from enterprise to mid-market, small, medium business, that's really, does it affect the substance? Does it affect some of the facts? Or let's say if it's content about your offerings, do you have different offerings you would make available? Or are you appealing to some different personas? Is there a different buying dynamic in different market segments? You may see different people involved in their buying motion or the buying scenario. So that may be some clues for you about both your offerings, the persona, and then what is their life cycle like? So when do they like to consume content?
Yeah, I think that's the key thing, isn't it? It's just that matching the audience needs just to increase the resonance. And it's so important. And knowing what surface they like to use to actually consume their content is massive. And depending on their role and the sector they sit in, those could vary quite a lot. And content intelligence can really sort of help deliver that. And we're seeing the advancement as well, aren't we, of AI and ML, being able to actually predict and suggest how you should deliver your content. And when you're producing content, did you know that this particular content usually works at this time, or it normally resonates the best if you present it in this particular format? That kind of AI ML technology that's coming through is also really, really useful. So let's look down. We've got some more. So is it too complex or sophisticated for most companies to track content with revenue recognition and sales activities?
So I'll say overall, I've not seen a majority of organizations able to do that. And there's varying reasons for that. In terms of content attribution, it's pretty murky territory for some organizations. Usually if you bite off pieces of that, are there ways that you could look at sales content usage? Maybe that's a piece of it. Are there things that you could do in looking at your customers' usage and any of your analytics, of course, from your digital properties, that you would be able to piece together? Where have you had some content used along the way? But I find, I don't know if Emerson, if you have more to say on this, I don't find a lot of organizations who are confident all the way through on everything.
No, I would agree. I mean, just picking up on the word complex as well, complexity, we come across that so much. We also talk about content maturity, knowing where you are in your maturity level. Where do you want to get? What's the journey that you want to go on? Are you just publishing to a single channel, or are you doing it to more than one right now? And where do you want to get to? Do you have multiple teams producing different content for different formats? In which case, could that be optimized? Are you producing content without structuring it and enabling reuse? All of that maturity, and then again as well, bringing into that is the ecosystem, is the connectivity. Does your content production program or platform connect wider to everything else that you've got within your content ecosystem? So it goes beyond just sort of sales marketing, really. But customer satisfaction, coming back to that as well, obviously is delivered right across the business at every touch point. So an important thing to remember there as well. Here's one. B2B content seems to be changing quickly, from ebooks to now podcasts and videos. Do you think any specific format is here to stay? And what will be the next content medium? And also say, wonderful presentation, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, content is changing. You're right. I do think we've evolved to where all the different screens and how people are consuming content, our attention spans. You're right that the rise of podcasts, or what kinds of audio content people may have, video, for sure. If you could do any slice of analysis of the generational changes and preferences, or different parts of the world and what people will consume. I do think we're going to see some things stay in terms of websites, or you're going to have some of your assets for sure. If you're explaining your offerings or you're explaining the very crux of doing business, you're going to have some of those, I'll call it written assets, that there's substance and copy to it. But for sure, you're going to see people appealing at different stages to when people want to learn or listen to things. Where is there stuff? We've seen the rise of more education and entertainment like content. Mm-hmm. But I think some of that factual content, the doing the business, a lot of that will of course stay. We may evolve stylistically, but it's going to stay.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Creativity, I think, is a key driver for change with content consumption. But with things like compliance and regulation, there needs to be content needs to be documented. So it still needs to be documented somewhere in a way that people can get to easily and consume it nice and clearly. So there'll always be a need for that. Okay, so we have one more question, I think, which is, can you please elaborate more on how to increase retention?
That's an interesting one, where in looking at how is content helping you with your customer satisfaction and retention? You could have the argument of, do you track what are your customers seeing from you after they've been onboarded and the use of offerings? Some teams, it may be, again, it's very reactive, or it's very siloed view of what content is reaching your customers. So if you're being very intentional about the retention aspect of that, it's not just popping up at renewal time. It's not just hammering with newsletters or offers for buying more. You've got to be a lot more attuned. And that requires that collaboration across teams. What is going on with your customer? Are you able to be a steady source of information and content for them in what they are going through with the use of your offerings? What's going on in their industry? So that if you're continuously coming out with not just information about your offerings, how to use them better, but think of it retention-wise as, what is it like in having a relationship with you? Are you doing some things that are informative and valuable for the customer?
Yeah, absolutely, 100% agree with that. It's value and customer experience, and just making sure that all the content that goes across to your customers and engages with your customers is, creative. It suits them. It's timely when they want it, but also, and very importantly, gives them the best possible experience.
That's right. It's easy for them to find things when they need something. They can find it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we're done for questions. So, Brenda, we'll bring you back in here.
Thank you so much, Lisa and Emerson, for that great presentation. And to our audience members, thank you for taking the time to submit your questions. Those were very great questions, and we got a lot of great notes and feedback there from those responses. So I'm sure our attendees are going to want to, watch this again. So great news, this is recorded, and we will go ahead and send a link to today's webinar recording via email so that you can rewatch it, take additional notes, or even share it with your team members here. So lots of great content to revisit. Lisa, Emerson, again, I want to say thank you both for being here today, and to Quark for sponsoring today's webinar and making it all possible. And with that, I will go ahead and let everyone go. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and we'll see you all on the next one.